Hello, my name is Jackson Stuff, and this is the video presentation of my senior independent study that I have titled A Call to Lights, Camera, and Action: How Hollywood Woke America to the Nazi Threat. So what this IS is about. I looked at how Hollywood was able to change American opinions on Nazism and interventionism. The idea of Nazism, the Nazis as a force of government and ideology, and then interventionism. The argument that the United States had to intervene on the side of the Allies against the Nazis uh, during World War II while America was still neutral. And since I'm focusing on Hollywood, for this independent study, I examined 7 feature films and 2 comedic shorts, all of which have a strong anti-Nazi and/or a strong pro-intervention narrative within the film itself. And for looking at these films and over this overall study, a lot of my research relies on John Wycliffe Chambers II, Alan Rostron, and Theodore Adorno, in addition to many other scholars who have examined the films themselves in great detail. So, what my research found from the 3 researchers. So, I relied on Chambers, because Chambers looked at the broad anti-war groups that tried to influence Hollywood. Because it wasn't just the America First Committee. That's one of the more famous anti-war groups that is from this time period. There are also numerous other ones, more leftist and internationalist peace groups that initially tried to get Hollywood to see that anti-war films were a profitable business. While the America First Committee, which is a more conservative group, tried to censor Hollywood whenever they can using government influence. And Chambers analyzes all of these very broad anti-war groups, and that gives a deeper political background to this research. And then there was Alan Rostron. Rostron looked at the Hollywood studios as they tried to respond to these very strong attacks from these various political groups, whether it was trying to co-opt the film studios with more pacifist messages, or to censor the studios from, again, groups like the America First Committee. And he shows that Hollywood tried to walk this tightrope between delivering content that Americans wanted to see while avoiding being charged with propaganda from the America First Committee. And also push these pro-intervention and anti-Nazi narratives. And then finally, Theodore Adorno joins the party here to explain how Hollywood was a part of what he called the culture industry, also known as mass media. And what Adorno argued that with mass media and the culture industry is that they were so powerful as a force that they could dictate to audiences what a successful narrative or a successful film should be. He kind of argued that if Hollywood wanted a genre or an idea to be popular, they could make it popular by just forcing it on a viewing audience. However, he also made sure to include, though, Hollywood relies on the reactions of critics and viewers to adapt their narrative to be more acceptable to their audience. And so that's pretty much how I look at it. Hollywood was constantly adapting this narrative of anti-Nazism and pro-interventionism, and they were slowly but surely, for these America's neutrality period, pushing the envelope as far as they could each time to try and test how far they could go. And to make this narrative more acceptable to Americans, they constantly relied on reviewers such as Bosley Crowther of the New York Times, and also reactions from regular theater goers, to see, okay, how can we make this narrative more acceptable to the average American moviegoer? And Hollywood will start this off with the dramas. The first of the anti-Nazi films were anti-Nazi dramas, released in 1939 and 1940. The first of these was Confessions of a Nazi Spy, and Confessions was a very bold first attack against Nazism. It tried to warn Americans that Nazism was an enemy of the United States, that it was coming to destroy every basic American principle and value that we as Americans had. However, a lot of reviewers rejected this narrative. A lot of viewers rejected this narrative. Confessions was a critical and a commercial failure in American theaters. However, what Hollywood studios learned is the people did not have a problem with there being an anti-Nazi message. What their problem lied with was how heavy-handed this narrative was delivered. So, learning from this, the Hollywood studios adapted their new anti-Nazi dramas, such as The Mortal Storm and The Man I Married. Fun fact: The Man I Married was originally titled I Married a Nazi. Adopted a different and more successful approach by painting Nazism as this sort of corrupting force in the background. Like, you could see the Nazism in the movie, like Nazism as a force was present in the movie, but it wasn't threatening the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. It was taking characters who in the beginning of the movie were represented as kind and sweet and loving people, and slowly but surely, because of Nazism, those characters became more and more corrupted and evil and dark. And that corrupting force of Nazism, these films argued, could destroy everything from families to marriages. And Americans at this point began to feel much more distrustful of Nazism. So Nazism as an idea is starting to make Americans nervous. And so since Hollywood was able to push the boundary a little bit, Hollywood began to push the envelope further by criticizing Nazi and fascist governments directly. Hollywood was trying to show, okay, Americans are distrustful of the idea of Nazism. Now we need them to see that these governments that have formed around this ideology are enemies. So, the Three Stooges and Charlie Chaplin are the ones who actually are successfully able to deliver this narrative. With their comedies, You Nasty Spy, I'll Never Heil Again, and the most famous of them all, The Great Dictator. These films not only made fun of the Nazis, displaying their incompetence, their stupidity, their laughable sense of what was safe and appropriate, everything was criticized by these films, and very fun and very humorously so. However, what these comedies also did was that they contrasted these moments of levity and laughter with moments of pure, unbridled horror to show how awful and how brutal these governments actually were. Yes, you can laugh at them. They are a bunch of incompetent fools, but they are also rampaging throughout Europe and destroying innocent groups, such as the Jews, which Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator makes a big focus on. The Jews are represented as a kind and caring people who are constantly brutalized by the Nazi stormtroopers. And because of these comedies, Americans not only began to see Nazism as a corrupting and evil force, they began to see governments that follow this ideology as a violent and evil enemy. So, Hollywood has successfully casted the Nazis as the villains in the eyes of the 80 million theater-going Americans. And that's true, though, at this time. There were 80 million Americans going to movie theaters every week. So, for those people, they now saw the Nazis as the proper villain. Now, Hollywood has casted its villain. They now needed a hero. So, their heroes will come in the big war films that I focus on here, mainly Foreign Correspondent, Sergeant York, and A Yank in the RAF. Now, these films argued a message that the Nazis would not stop their war. They were not simply going to stop with Great Britain or the Soviet Union. They would keep going. That they were obsessed with bringing their Nazi anti-Semitic message to all corners of the globe. That was what Foreign Correspondent talked about. And those films argued that America must be ready to meet that challenge. Sergeant York would jump in there and add on, we must be ready to meet this challenge not because war is an adventure or fun, but because to defend American freedom and democracy, that fight is worth any price. And then finally, right almost 2 months before World War II broke out, A Yank in the RAF burst onto American screens and is a total 180 from most of these war movies because it presented war as dangerous, but the main character of Captain Powers, not Captain Powers, the main character played by Tyrone Power, as an adventurous and fun character who makes easy friends with the British, who these films argue that even though this war will be dangerous and it will be long, it is worth the price to defend American freedom because freedom is sacred. And that fight will be even more easy if we stand by our democratic allies such as the British. Now, what does all this mean? Thanks to the determination of Hollywood studios, they convinced Americans that the Nazis were a jackbooted nightmare, coming to destroy American democracy, freedom, civil liberties, human rights, you name it. The Nazis were going to tear that all away. They were a nightmare unseen of in human history. But because of Hollywood's skill in adapting a long narrative over the 2.5 years of America's neutrality period, Americans were convinced that this fight would not only be just, because any fight to defend freedom and democracy is always just. Their just fight would be even easier because they would have allies in the democratic British. So Hollywood actively shaped and pushed Americans to not only view Nazism from as this corrupting ideology, to Nazism as an evil government, to eventually an enemy that would be destroyed by a just war. Only in 2.5 years. So that is what I argue, that Hollywood, because of their work, actively moved these boundaries to create this. Here are my acknowledgments. I want to take this time to thank the various people who have helped me in this journey, because this IS was a very long but rewarding journey. I want to thank my mom and dad for always being in my corner through every step forward and every stumble backward. I want to thank my brothers, my sisters-in-law, and my niece and nephew for supporting me. I want to thank my Uncle Rex for getting me started on my love of history. I would like to thank Professor Hedinger, my advisor for this, for giving me a pat on the back or a kick in the butt depending on the situation. I'd like to thank Professor Holt, who started me on this journey with my junior IS through the pain of Microsoft Teams and many internet issues. I'd like to thank my education advisor, Professor Ozar, for reassuring me as I trained to be a teacher while doing this independent study. I'd like to thank Lynette Metzen of the Writing Center for being a valuable editor and saving me from my own grammar many times. I'd like to thank Mr. Flint, my old and beloved AP history teacher, for showing me what a great historian and educator can be. I'd like to thank my old English and AP English teacher, Mrs. Woolley, for encouraging me to expand my writing and my creativity. I'd like to thank my friend Bobby Ramkasoon for being my first friend on this campus. I'd also like to thank my other friend Jacob Shelton for always challenging me to be better at history. I'd like to thank my old friends from Cloverleaf who helped me find the confidence to succeed while I was away from home. And I'd like to also thank the wonderful friends that I have made here at Worcester who have helped me in this journey. And that is the end. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day.